There is an island off the west coast of Scotland where the ground itself is made of the dead, not built upon them, made of them, and the water around it does not forget. Every ship that ever came to bring a body to those shores, it remembers them all. I have sailed these northern waters more times than I can account for. The Scottish coast, she is not like the warm latitudes, where the sea has the decency to show her face. Up here, the sea hides. She wears the fog the way a widow wears black, not to mourn, but to conceal. I have passed Iona perhaps 100 times in these long centuries, always slow, always quiet. There is a gravity to that island that I cannot explain by any natural philosophy I know. A pull, as though the earth beneath it is hungry. I have seen things on those waters that I have told no living soul. Until now. If you can bear to hear what the island still whispers, these are not tales I tell lightly. 3 legends. 3 wounds that island has never healed. The first, a man buried alive who saw too much. The second, 68 men slaughtered at the tide's edge, still walking. And the third, the ships that still arrive in the night, carrying the dead who have never stopped coming home. We begin in the year 563, before the chapel had stones, before Oran had a grave. In the 6th century, when the world was hoar with age and steeped in shadow, a man came to Iona. Out of the emerald mists of Ireland he came, a captain of souls named Columba. A monk, they say, a saint, some whisper, though in those grey ancient dawns 'twas a title earned not by the gilding of altars, but by the scourging of flesh and the bitter bread of suffering. He sailed not for gold, but for the conquest of the great silence. 12 hands he brought to man his vessel, 12 shadows in rough wool. He brought a vision, sharp as a boarding pike, and he brought his kinsman, Oran, a man whose heart was a calm harbour in a world of storms. Their course was set fair, or so it seemed to land-bound eyes, to raise a stone hulk of a chapel upon this jagged tooth of an isle, and to light a beacon of God amidst the northern murk. A simple voyage, aye. So say those who ne'er felt the pull of a cursed tide. But Iona, she had a different mind. She was no docile bride to their prayers. Every bulwark they raised by day, the isle did cast down by night. 'Twas no gale that felled them, nor the clumsy craft of green hands. Nay, these men knew the weight and will of stone as a boatswain knows his ropes. The walls simply declined to stand. They shied away from the sky. 'Twas as if the very ribs of the earth were heaving against the intrusion. I have seen this sort of thing before, a place that will not be tamed by human purpose. The sea does it too with certain passages, pushes back, says, not yet, not without cost. Columba fasted. He prayed, he kept vigil through the long northern nights, and then a vision came. The vision told him this: the chapel would not stand until a living man was laid within its foundations, a willing man, a man who understood what he was being asked, a sacrifice. I am not a man of God, haven't been for a very long time. But even in my bleakest years, even in waters where I've cursed every god I ever knew, I have never believed that God asks for such things. What speaks in visions is not always what it claims to be. But Columba believed. and Oran heard. The moon was but a sliver of bone in a sky of bruised velvet when Oran stepped forth. No fanfare of trumpets, mind ye, no grand parley with the heavens. He stood there, his feet upon the very lip of the abyss they'd scoured into the isle's cold breast. He was no wild-eyed zealot, no mutineer seeking the gallows glory of a martyr. Nay, he offered his life as a seasoned mariner offers a dry cloak to a shivering mate, simply because the wind bit hard and he had the wool to spare. "I shall go," he spake. 3 words, short as a death knell, yet heavy enough to sink a Spanish galleon. Columba, that captain of saints, he didst not stay the hand of fate. He stood as still as a figurehead carved from heart of oak, while the lanterns flickered like the dying eyes of a gutted fish. That kind of sacrifice is rarer and more terrible than any performed in fire and proclamation. The entire community gathered. By the guttering light of lanterns they scoured a shallow berth, 3 feet into the isle's cold breast, a shallow berth for a soul so vast. Oran lay down in the earth. He crossed his hands, and when the first shovelful of earth struck his chest, 'twas a sound I've heard but once before, when the sea claims a good man and the hull groans in sympathy. Oran closed his eyes, not in fear, but as one who prepares for a long watch in the crow's nest of eternity. Columba wept. The records say this plainly: he wept without stopping, and still he gave no order to halt. The earth covered Oran's feet, his legs, his chest, his face, still, lips pressed together, not struggling. The stones went over him after, the foundation, the first course of the chapel wall, and it stood, as it has stood for 1400 years. 3 days passed, 3 days of building, 3 days of prayer, 3 days of Columba saying nothing and eating nothing and watching the walls rise with an expression that no monk who witnessed it ever found words to describe adequately. 3 suns rose and died, bleeding their pale light over Iona's crags. At the turning of the tide on that 3rd noon, Columba gave the word. "Break the seal," he commanded, his voice a rusted hinge. He ordered the grave opened. The monks fell to it, their fingernails blackened by the peat, clawing at the earth like crabs in a frenzy. And there, by the great Leviathan, there he bided. Oran was no ghost, no pale spectre of the spindrift. He sat up in that narrow berth, the earth falling from his shoulders like scales from a serpent. He breathed, not the gasping breath of a drowned boy, but the deep, steady draught of a man who had walked the sea floor and found it empty. His eyes, those eyes, they had the sheen of pearls left too long in the dark. He looked upon Columba and he spake with a tongue that had tasted the brine of eternity. "There be no great wonder in the locker of death," he whispered, and the very wind didst hold its breath. "Nor is hell the furnace the priests do paint, nor heaven the golden harbour, the desperate crave." 12 words, a broadside fired straight into the hull of the church. 'Twas then I saw the saint's holiness curdle into a tyrant's wrath. For what is a captain without a chart? If Oran's truth were to spread, the very masts of faith would snap like dry kindling. Oran had been there, wherever there is. He had seen what waits, and what he had seen did not match what Columba had built his entire life upon. Not damnation and glory, something else, something more complicated, something the church in 563 AD could not permit to be spoken aloud. Think on what Columba felt in that moment. This was not a stranger speaking heresy. This was his cousin, the man he loved most, the man who had willingly entered the earth for him, and that man was now looking at him with eyes that had seen the truth, and that truth was quietly, undeniably destroying everything. Columba's face became a jagged reef, and then he spoke the words that have echoed across those stones ever since. "Earth, earth upon Oran's eye," the saint thundered, his voice cracking like a mainmast in a nor'easter, lest he shouldst pipe more of these foul tidings to the flock. The monks, those trembling bilge rats, scooped the cold, weeping clay. They did not wait for Oran to lie back. They cast the dirt upon his upturned face, while his lips, aye, those pale, salt-cracked lips, yet moved with the secrets of the deep. "Clay, clay upon his moor," Columba cried, "that he mayest hale us no further from the shoals of heresy." They buried him alive. Again, still speaking, still trying to tell them. The chapel was completed above him, its stones heavy as a galleon's ballast, and to wash the blood from his own hands, Columba did christen the place with the name of the man he'd silenced, Saint Oran's chapel. A fine jest, aye, to nail a man's name to the very roof that keeps him crushed in the dark. They gave him the title of saint as a gilded shroud, hoping that by honouring his bones the world might forget the heresy of his tongue. They turned his tomb into an altar, his agony into a litany. But a name upon a stone is but a painted flag on a derelict hull. It changes naught of the rot beneath. The cemetery around it, Rhylig or Drine, became the most sacred burial ground in Scotland. 48 medieval kings were buried in that land above him. Crowns of Scotland, high kings of Ireland, and the iron-blooded lords of Norway, all sharing the soil with the one man who truly knew what lay beneath. All of them pressing him down, century by century. I've stood by that stone wall when the moon hung like a pale, drowned corpse in the black rigging of the sky. I never set foot within, I confess it. Something in my blood, some ancient mariner's instinct, did strike my colours and bid me heave to at the gate. I stood there, picturing the dark cargo of souls resting in that unholy berth. I've heard the greybeards of the sea whisper in low taverns that if ye lay your ear to the cold stone, past the keening of the gale and the gnashing of the tide, you can hear him, a scratching, a muffled cry, like a ghost signal from a vessel that refuses to find the bottom. Oran, he is there yet, still trying, still reaching up through 1400 years of stone and faith and royal bones, still trying to finish what he started, still trying to warn us about what death is not, and what it might actually be. They had been watching for weeks. Iona's monks were not innocent of the world. They knew what the longships meant. They had heard the reports from Lindisfarne, from the Irish coast, from the Orkney settlements to the north. They had watched the horizon every morning at Lord's, praying, I suppose, that they would not see what they expected. Iona was no stranger to the sound of oars in the dark. The monks knew they would return. The Vikings had come before. In 795, they came. In 802, they came again. Each time they left with what they could carry and appetite for what they could not. On a morning in June of the year 806, they saw it. Sails, square-rigged, low-hulled, emerging from the Atlantic haze in that particular way that tells any sailor with experience what he is looking at. Dracars, not one, several, a fleet, organized, purposeful. This was not a raid, this was an expedition. They came for the metal, for the gold and silver that had accumulated in that monastery over 2 centuries of offerings and pilgrimage. They came for the cattle, they came for slaves. The monastery of Iona was not merely a place of prayer by 806. It was a center of political power, of accumulated wealth, of influence that stretched from Ireland to the Northern Isles. The Vikings understood value. The abbot, he was no green hand, nor a man of straw. When the horizon did swell with that threat of oak and iron, he read the winds as a master mariner reads a chart. The abbot made a decision that I have thought about often. He sent the youngest monks inland with the manuscripts, the sacred books, the illuminated texts, the irreplaceable records of centuries. He kept the elder brothers with him, 68 men, unarmed, robed, standing on a beach. I do not call that foolish. I have known soldiers who ran when they should have held. Those monks held what they had, their ground, their faith, their witness, with more steadiness than most armed men I've sailed beside. It simply was not enough. The Vikings beached their ships at the small bay on Iona's south end. The monks, unarmed and bound by their vows to non-violence, formed no defence. What followed was no fair fray, shipmate, no clash of blade on blade, nor the roar of a boarding party. 'Twas a mere shambles, a slaughterhouse beneath the June sun. I will not dwell on the particulars. You know what a slaughter sounds like, whether you have witnessed one or only imagined it. The imagination is usually accurate enough. Those northern wolves, those heathen hounds, leapt from their gunwales with axe in hand and the hunger of beasts in their eye. And the 60 and 8, they stood fast, like pilings that the tide cannot sunder. They raised no fist, they begged no quarter. They didst but pray, their voices drowning beneath the weight of iron. I have seen bloodletting in Tortuga and hangings at Plymouth, but naught like this. The blood didst not run, it gorged the pale strand, turning the sand into a gun deck after the final broadside. The sea sought to claim the souls, but the earth held them fast. 60 and 8 men, put to the edge of the steel without a battle cry. 60 and 8 souls, a heavy manifest for so small a strand, and a debt the sea hath yet to pay in full. In the end, the only sound was the lap of the tide against the dragon prows, and the drip of the red from the scuppers of that cursed beach. The bay has been called Martyrs Bay ever since. Martyrs Bay. The name has held for 1200 years, which tells you something about how the islanders remember. The shades began being reported long after, no one can say precisely when. But they come from the water at dusk, in the particular light of a Scottish sunset. When the sky runs red and the sand takes on that rust-coloured hue, it has never quite lost. Figures, robed, moving inland with the heavy, deliberate step of men who have walked this path before. People try to count them. They always lose count at 67. The 68th never quite resolves from the mist, as if something about that last figure resists being numbered, resists being known. They move toward the vallum, the ancient earthwork ditch that once marked the boundary of the monastery, and fade before they reach it. Every night, re-walking the last path they ever walked in life, forever arriving, forever falling short. But the story does not end in 806. That is what makes Iona different from other places of massacre. The Vikings left, and the island, against all reason, against all counsel, refused to die. A small community remained. They rebuilt nothing grand. They made themselves invisible, hiding in the caves and crevices of the island whenever a square sail appeared on the horizon, living like ghosts among the ruins of what their brothers had tried to protect. For 19 years, they endured. And then came 825, and a monk named Blathmac MacFlean. Now, Blathmac was not an ordinary man pressed into an extraordinary situation. He came to Iona by choice, in full knowledge of what had happened in 806. He came specifically because he understood what the island still held, and what the Vikings would inevitably return to take. The relics of Saint Columba, the bones of the saint himself housed in a shrine of gold and silver, a portable reliquary, encrusted with jewels and sacred metalwork, worth more to a Viking war chief than a season's worth of raiding. Blathmac knew they would come for it, so he made a decision that I find remarkable, even across the long centuries of my acquaintance with remarkable decisions. He buried the shrine himself, alone, under the earth, beneath the grass, in a location he told no one, not his abbot, not his closest brothers. No one knew but him. He made himself the lock and swallowed the key. In 825, the Vikings returned. They came during the Mass. They surrounded the church while the brothers were at prayer, a deliberate choice, timed for maximum terror and containment. They demanded the gold. They demanded the shrine. Blathmac looked at them from the steps of the altar and spoke words that were recorded by a monk who survived by hiding, words that have come down to us across 12 centuries with the weight of stone. I know where it lies. But my lips are a sealed tomb. What followed is recorded in the chronicles without embellishment, because embellishment was unnecessary. They took him apart, piece by piece, on the steps of his own altar. He did not speak, not a direction, not a hint, not a sound that could be interpreted as a clue. The shrine was never found. The Vikings left Iona empty-handed, with nothing but blood on their axes and a fury they had no way to spend. I have known hard men. I have been a hard man in seasons I would rather not account for. But that kind of hardness, the hardness that holds a secret while the body is unmade, that is not courage as most men know it. That is something older, something the sea herself respects. I tip what remains of my hat to Blathmac of Iona, wherever he is now. And so we return to the beach at dusk, to the figures that come from the water when the light is red and the sand is the colour of old rust. 68 monks walking the last path they walked in 806, and always, always one ahead of the rest, moving with a different quality, a different weight, not the shuffle of men reliving their final moments, the stride of a man still on duty. Blathmac is always first. He does not walk that beach because he cannot rest. He walks it because he has not yet been relieved of his post. The shrine is still out there, beneath the grass, beneath the stone, beneath whatever 12 centuries of Iona's weather has done to the earth above it. His secret is still intact. The Vikings never found it. No one has found it since. Every night that Blathmac fades before he reaches the Vallum is another night the secret holds. Another victory. He won in 825. He wins every night since. The sand still carries the colour of what was spilled there. The monks still walk, and Blathmac still leads them, not because death bound him to that shore, but because duty did. And duty, it seems, outlasts everything, even the man who carried it, even the island that holds his bones, even the sea that remembers his silence. For more than 500 years, Iona was the burial ground of kings. Not a metaphor, not a legend. Fact. 48 monarchs, Scottish, Norse, Irish, were transported across open water to be laid in the earth of Rhylig Odrine, beside the chapel that stands on Oran's bones. Kenneth MacAlpin, who first united Scotland. Macbeth, aye, that Macbeth. The real one, not the one the playwright made of him. A competent king by the standards of his age, killed in battle, carried to Iona like all the rest. Norse jarls who had raided those very coasts and who, at life's end, converted for the specific purpose of earning a grave in that particular ground. Even hardened men, men who had burned and taken and sailed under no law but their own, knew that there was something in that island's soil worth petitioning for. Something that made dying easier if you could be carried there. I understand the feeling. The funeral ships that carried royal bodies to Iona were known as death ships, and they were regarded with a particular dread that went beyond mere superstition. Fishermen would not approach them. Other vessels altered course to give them a wide berth, not out of disrespect for the dead, on the contrary, out of a very specific and practical fear. The death ships sailed differently. No sound of oars, though the oars moved. No bow wave, though the hull cut water. They glided, that is the word that appears in account after account from different centuries, different languages, glided, as if carried by a current no living vessel could feel, against the wind when the wind was against them, through conditions that should have made passage impossible, arriving always, always arriving. I have come to believe, in my long centuries on these waters, that the dead have more command over the sea than the living do. The sea was here before us. The dead are closer to what the sea understands. Perhaps it is natural that she grants them passage. The sightings of the Phantom Fleet are oldest in the oral record. No one knows how far back they go. The first written account I have found dates to 1563, exactly 1,000 years after Columba's arrival, which may or may not be significant. A priest on the mainland watching the Sound of Iona on the night before All Hallows Eve records seeing in his journal a great number of dark-sailed vessels passing in procession toward the Holy Island, making no sound whatsoever, carrying what appeared to be great boxes or coffins upon their decks, which did float from the ships to the shore of their own accord when the vessels reached anchorage. He records that the procession lasted approximately half an hour. He records that when he looked down from his notes to the water again, the fog had closed in and nothing was visible. He records finally, and I find this detail most affecting, that he checked his candle when he looked up and found that 3 hours had passed where he believed only minutes had. Time moves differently around those ships. I know this from my own experience. They still come. The reports are consistent across 4 centuries. Halloween, Samhain, the deep nights of October, witnesses on the mainland or on the water itself reporting a procession of black-sailed vessels approaching Iona's harbour. Silent, purposeful, and then the coffins moving inland, floating, the witnesses say, 3 feet above the cobblestones of the Shraid Nam Marb, the Street of the Dead, following the ancient path toward Railig Odrain, with the absolute confidence of things that have made this journey many times before. No bearers, no ceremony, beyond the procession itself. The coffins simply proceed. In the morning, the beach holds nothing. No keel marks in the sand, no wax, no splinters, no evidence of anchorage. The graves in Railig Odrain are undisturbed, at least undisturbed in the way that can be measured. But some mornings, visitors to the cemetery find flowers on ancient graves, fresh flowers, on graves whose families died out 6 centuries ago, on graves where no living person has a reason to leave an offering, and occasionally, rarely, but recorded, and recorded by people with no reason to fabricate, a name appears on an ancient headstone that was not there the morning before. A name, a date. The date is always recent, always within a day or two. And when the investigators trace it, as they have several times with careful effort, the name matches a person who died elsewhere on that same night, hundreds of miles away. A man in Edinburgh, a woman in Dublin, a fisherman lost somewhere in the North Atlantic. Found, claimed, called home to an island they may never have visited in life. The island still calls the dead. And the dead, it seems, still answer. I saw the Phantom Fleet myself. Twice, as I have said. Once in 1703, a clear October night, the kind the Scottish coast grants you perhaps 3 or 4 times a season, where the stars are visible and the water is almost calm. I was running before a light wind, perhaps 2 miles offshore. My crew was below. I was alone at the helm when the fog came up from nowhere, a wall of it advancing with purpose. No weather reason for it that I could account for. And then, through the fog, the ships, black sails, black hulls, moving against what little wind remained, silent as judgment. 7 vessels, perhaps 8. The fog made counting uncertain. On each deck, shapes, not men, boxes, heavy, elaborate, covered in symbols I could not read from that distance but recognized as old. Older than the monastery, older than the church that built it. They passed perhaps a 1/4 mile ahead of me. I did not follow. Some things, you understand without instruction, should not be followed. The second time, 1889, same fog, different century, same ships. I remember thinking, they have not aged. 186 years since I last saw them, and the ships were precisely as I remembered. The same sails, the same silence, the same quality of movement, as if the water was cooperating with them specifically. And I thought of all the dead they had carried since 1703, all the names that had appeared on those ancient stones, all the flowers left on graves by hands that left no footprints. The sea does not forget where the kings are buried. The island does not forget what it is owed. And the dead do not forget the old roads, even when every living map has stopped marking them. 48 kings in that ground. Oran beneath the chapel still murmuring. Blathmac on the beach still walking. And the fleet still arriving every autumn with its silent cargo. That is what Iona is. Not a place the dead rest, a place they govern. And the living are simply visitors who have not yet received their invitation to stay.